All right, good morning and welcome to today's webinar. I've been looking very much forward to presenting for you today. And today we're going to talk about AI and data-driven sales. It is a big passion topic of mine. And my name is Oliver. I'm a director here at Quadrant Consulting. I love Excel and data and systems. So this is right up my alley. And I think, like many other people, I'm very interested in AI and what's happening. It's a super exciting time for nerds like me to be alive. So today I'm happy to share with you a bit about the topic and a bit about how it applies in the commercial arena. And I think where the challenge lies is really applying it out in everyday life. So that's the whole focus of today. We're going to make it really tangible and talk about some simple use cases that hopefully can help you get you some inspiration and kind of get started with AI if you're not started already. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the state of the nation and AI and data-driven tools in commercial organizations. Then we're going to talk a bit about 3 tangible use cases. And then we're going to dive into how to get started by identifying, testing, and scaling these AI tools in your commercial organization. 3 guiding principles are kind of framing this session today. And the first one is it's going to be pragmatism over philosophy. So we're going to try to get nice and concrete and give you some very practical inspiration, because that's where at least we experience the main challenge lies for most commercial leaders, is going from this huge potential AI has down to a specific use case. Second of all, it's going to be explorative. And again, in this arena that's evolving so rapidly and so much, I think a good portion of humbleness is needed. So we're not going to pretend we have the one truth to rule them all. So much happens all the time with new tools and new learnings that I think it's incredibly important to have an open mindset and take it almost day by day and explore as we go. And thirdly, it's going to be more focused on sales than on marketing. And that's because it's especially within the sales domain that it is difficult for commercial leaders to get to these good use cases. So we're going to focus a bit more on that today. And then I promise you no new like top 10 new AI tools. You have seen that on LinkedIn 1,000 times. So I promise we're not gonna go through that. All right. Let's get started. And I just want to start with the potential of AI. And I'm sure you've all heard this before and seen figures like these before, but the expectations for AI are really unprecedented within the last few decades, with value kind of estimates in the trillions of dollars, with 85% of CEOs thinking that this is going to lead to the next new strategic advantage, and an expected 15% increase in GDP in the US. We get a little kind of, we lose sight of actually how crazy these numbers are, but just kind of really encapsulates how immense people believe the potential for these new technologies are. And with that outset, I think the hype has been going on for a few years now that AI is really going to revolutionize the way we work and the way the maybe entire world works, actually. And if we look a little bit about at where are we today, what's happened in the last 2 years for many since ChatGPT came out, I think that's the big kind of turning point for most of us. Then it has had a lot of impact, especially within coding, for example, where task completion speed is improved 30%, even 50% in some specific cases. It has, I would say, revolutionized the coding industry. We're also seeing some cool stuff in creative. There's this 45-second Volvo mock TV ad, which is not created by Volvo, but by one person in 24 hours with a few AI tools and just a little bit of Photoshop for the license plate and so on. But we're really seeing some big moves here in creative, and it's only expected to get better, right? This a TV ad like this would probably take around 6 weeks and $500,000 to create, and now it's one person in 24 hours. So of course, incredibly greenwashy, but it's more about the actual creation of the content that's impressive in this case. Okay, so we have seen some strong applications, but what about the commercial space? What about the commercial arena that, of course, we are more interested in? And I think in this space, we have seen some good use cases, some use cases that are worthwhile on their own, but we haven't really seen that killer use case yet. And what I mean by that is that we've seen these tender cases, RFP automation. I'm going to show you one later, which decreases time spent by 30%, which is great. But again, it's worthwhile in its own, but it's not something that revolutionizes how we do sales. It improves the process, but it's not like, okay, replace the entire sales force tomorrow kind of thing. We've also seen it for sales calls, analysis, and meeting transcripts. Again, great, especially if you're doing all your sales interactions in English and virtually. It's not the case for most people in the Nordics. We have automatic data log in CRM. Again, really big quality of life improvement, and also enables some data analysis over time. So again, a good use case. We have this automated customer service and calls. Again, the more B2C-like an industry is, the more relevant this is, the more volume you have. There's some dynamic pricing. And then this has been the fully automated SDR or AE that has been tried, has failed. It hasn't really worked. Maybe it will in the future, but at least not for the next 5 years. It just isn't human enough in how it thinks and responds. So I think the main conclusion is we haven't really seen this killer use case yet in AI in the commercial space. And what does that mean for us? Where is this revolution that we have been promised? And my take is, I think, a very pragmatic take. It's definitely not a pessimistic take, but I think the hype is fading and reality is starting to set in. And I think a good way to explain this is via Gartner's hype cycle, which I think is actually a pretty good tool for understanding conceptually how expectations adjust over time for new innovations, just like AI. And after it starts and it has kind of gained initial traction, it goes really, really high up the expectations, hits a peak, and then it comes down again to this trough of disillusionment where people find out, okay, there's actually a lot of stuff it can't do. And then slowly we get to the slope of enlightenment where we get nice and productive and expectations are aligned with reality. And I think that's pretty much what's happening with Gen AI now. I think about a year ago, we were at the top of the peak, and now we are kind of down the slope. Some people believe we are starting to hit the bottom and on our way kind of going up soon. Some people believe we're halfway there. There's still a bit to go. It's hard to say at this point, but I think the overall take is just that the hype is fading, and now we're getting to this point again where we all buy that it is going to be revolutionary. It is going to be the next big thing, but we also struggle with creating real life use cases and getting it to work in our organizations. So I think that's where we are at the moment. And I think what has happened since we were at the top of the peak is that people are learning that AI is of course great, but if you don't have the right data, if you don't have the right processes, if you don't have the right implementation and change management, it's not going to work, right? It's not a magic cure-all. It's not going to fix all our problems. Unfortunately, that would be great, but it's just not the case. Instead, we've gotten some pretty good learnings here. We've learned that technology is not going to fix a bad process. Maybe some of you have been involved in CRM implementations that didn't fix the sales process automatically. Again, unfortunately so, would be great. But the same is the case for AI. It's a new data-driven tool for the toolbox. it's not a complete replacement of the toolbox that we have. And often AI or Gen AI is something that works together with other kinds of sales tools, so something more rule-based and more algorithmic, where AI is typically the interface because it's really good at being that kind of interface, and then have underlying processes kind of behind it. So I think AI is it is of course different. It's a super powerful tool, but it's not that different from other data-driven sales tools. And I think kind of getting overly focused on AI on its own is a pitfall that we have to be aware of. Second learning, AI, again, is a tool to be used by people. It's an augmentative technology. It's not a replacement of people, at least for the next 5 years. You're not going to see entire functions get replaced. You might see functions that go from 10 people to 8 people to 5 people because they get more and more effective, but you're probably not going to see entire departments removed, at least for the next 5-10 years. Last learning here is that these data-driven tools and AI can make processes better and can make processes faster. If we kind of try to narrow it down, it can also reimagine entire processes, but mostly it's about making them faster or better. And some processes are better suited for this automation than others. And if we look at the processes that are most suited for being automated, it's the ones that are operational, that are well-defined, that are repetitive, and often high volume, high resource spend, that increases our incentive to automate them. The ones on the other end of the spectrum are the contextual, the strategic, the one-off assignments that require a lot of context, that both can be hard for AI to process, but also hard for us as humans to put into the AI model because it needs so much input. And what's probably going to happen is that over time, it's going to shift so that it gets better and better and better at taking on more and more strategic tasks. But for now, we have to define the context within which these tools have to operate. And once we've done that, they can execute brilliantly, like a lot faster than humans can do, of course. But without that context around it, it just doesn't get the output that we need. So we still have to decide what to do and how to do it, the frames around the exercise or the task, and then we can outsource the execution to AI and other data-driven tools. I think a lot of parallels can be drawn to the IT outsourcing boom that we saw a few decades ago, where at first companies were really glad just to outsource and get things done at a fraction of the cost. But then there was a learning curve where companies acknowledged that you actually have to be a bit closer to the process than they thought initially. If you want to get the right output, you have to put the right frames and define the tasks. And I think the same thing is true for AI. Again, you have to define and frame what you need, and then the execution can be, so to speak, outsourced to these tools with great results. Getting an AI tool in place requires a few building blocks that we need to have for these tools to work. And there is some data we need in place. There's an application layer, which is the technology layer. And then we have a use case layer and then some users. And there are two ways of getting these building blocks in place. One is starting from the bottom and getting all the data in place, like a giant pan-organizational data readiness project where we end-to-end get everything in place. Then we find the right technology, the newest, the coolest, the best. Then we find some use cases, and then we find some users in the end. The other approach is to start from the users and say, okay, the salespeople, what do they do on an everyday basis? Okay, they have these tasks. Well, if they needed to solve this better, what would they need? Then you find the technology and then you find the data. And what we recommend quite heavily is starting with the users and the use case, because that way it's the solution is going to be way more specific to what's actually required. Instead of building something really big and then finding users, it can get a bit more forced. And often what you build is not 100% what's needed at the front line. So once we start from the front line and work our way back, we solve something for someone instead of everything for no one. I want to put it into a little bit of a cliche, but I actually think it's true. The more specific it can be, the more it helps us get the right technology and the right data to solve that very specific use case. And typically that just gets a much, much better result in the end. Okay, that was a quick overview of the state of the nation with AI in commercial organizations. What I like now is to share 3 quickfire use cases just to give you some inspiration. I mean, on each of these use cases, we could spend an entire webinar, but I'm just going to go through them fairly quickly to give you an idea of what these use cases can be. The first one, as I mentioned before, is an RFP automation tool for a health tech company. It's a global company, and they sell hospital beds and other equipment to hospitals. Around 40% of their revenue is from RFPs, so a very big share. It's quite important to their commercial engine and how that works. And just in one core market, they had more than 200 RFPs per year. So as you can imagine, that's a lot of RFPs. And the problem with these RFPs is, of course, that it's very manual. It's a time-consuming process. You get different formats from different potential customers. And getting all this data requires you to involve different departments within your own company. And again, that means there are coordination costs. You have to wait, and you have to get stuff from your colleagues. So really, it's a quite tedious task to make these RFPs, and it's not a very high value-add task to find the right product descriptions and put them into another template and format it. What happened in this case is the solution is that we built an AI tool that has access to all the different product databases and all the product sheets, and then it finds the right data, extracts it and formats it, and puts it into the right format that's required for that specific RFP. And the smart thing with this, of course, is that you can also make it give you the sources and the level of accuracy it believes it has for the information where it found it, because of course it has to be true. It has to be right what goes into the RFP, and so it can also provide you links where you can go and check if it has a low probability or low certainty score on some of these product descriptions. The result was a 30% reduction in RFP preparation time. So really a big chunk taken out of the RFPs. And again, the chunk that was taken out was the boring part, the low value add part. So the salespeople could spend more time actually on the kind of value selling aspects of making the RFP and hopefully engaging the customer also at an earlier stage. So quite a big time reduction in making this tool. Second example is from it's a sales interaction tool for a fueling company, and they drive their customer acquisitions by inside sales. They sell these fueling cards for smaller businesses. So as you can imagine, this is in the US. There are a lot of smaller businesses, and there are a lot of inside sales reps. And it's a large and shifting force. And that means that it's hard for the sellers to have a shared best practice because there's a kind of a high turnaround in the department. And also, in order to sell these fueling cards, the sellers need extensive information on all the fueling locations that are nearby the customer, and that's the entire US. So more than you can commit to memory. And they also need to know the competitive fueling locations, and they also need to know the available rebates at that moment. So they need a lot of information that requires something of a superhuman to have at any one time. The solution in this case was an interactive AI tool, again with this AI interface, that guides the conversation flow based on what the customer or the prospect responds, and then also a map of the network. So if you're in a conversation with a potential customer, you can type in the address and you can see which fueling stations are nearby. And then you can also have, for example, a guided conversation flow, a savings calculator, and so on, all embedded in this simple to use interface that the sales reps can use both to get the right guidance through the conversation, so we can weave in some of the sales best practice, but also all that information on network area and distance to different fueling locations, depending on where the customer is. So the impact of this is that the lead conversion rate increased by 4.5%, percentage points. So it's almost a 25% increase, which is quite substantial here. And also the days from lead to op dropped from 12 to 7, meaning that the overall sales velocity was greatly increased by this new tool to help guide and guide and onboard and help the inside sellers sell more. Final use case is a construction company selling windows, and they did a segmentation service. And this is a global window producer, and the way they sell their windows is through dealers and then installers, and then the windows make their way to the homeowner. The particular audience in this case is the installers. They are covered by field sales. And the tricky thing with these installers is that because they buy from the dealers, there's no direct sales data. So it's really hard to know exactly how much an installer installs, which types of products they install, and how good or attractive an overall customer they are. And the field sales reps, they have to decide who should they visit and what should they talk to those accounts about. And that's a little bit difficult when you don't have that much data on which accounts are actually the right ones to visit. What makes it even more difficult is that they have really big portfolios, many of them 500, many of them more than 1,000 accounts. So sitting down and going to their website, for example, or investigating them, researching them online, or through different databases is really time consuming and not something that you have time for if you have to make 12 or 16 visits every week. The solution in this case was making an integrated segmentation service that would take and pool data from all the different sources in the company, both the CRM, the ERP system, the loyalty program, web scraping, and then gather that into a data pipeline. And then on top of that, run a segmentation logic that allows us to say how many times a year should this account be visited and what's the most relevant topic to talk to the installer about. So for example, if they only sell basic products, maybe we talk to them about an electric or a premium product with a blind or a shutter or other kind of accessories on top. So there's both the visit allocation and the topic, and then that's fed directly into the CRM system, so the salespeople, they can use that when they plan their visits. The outcome of this is, of course, difficult to measure. Again, we don't have the direct sales data, but what we can say is that in one of the first markets this was run, there was 96% of the accounts that were spit out by the model were deemed relevant by the sales reps. And even more astounding here, that 65% of the accounts the first year, they had not been visited before, but they were relevant. So there, again, it confirmed the suspicion that there were a lot of accounts in the market that were relevant for us to talk to, but that we simply didn't know existed or didn't talk to because we couldn't have that overview with all this data here. Okay, so just circling back to what we talked about before, I think these three cases, what they have in common is that they start with a specific challenge for specific users. So for specific users and specific use cases, then they find the enabling technology and the enabling data that allows them to solve that very specific problem for a specific audience. And I just wanted to highlight this to illustrate again that when you do that, you typically end up with much better results for that specific audience that you're trying to solve something for. Okay, how do you then get started? Because seeing these inspirational cases is of course all good and dandy, but if you're staring at a blank cursor just blinking at you on the screen, how do you actually get started by finding out where and if there's potential for you to start with these AI or data-driven sales tool cases? And we have a framework for that, and it has 4 steps. I'm going to go through all of these steps in detail. But first, we call it the proof of play. The first step is all about identifying and mapping and kind of prioritizing where to start. After that is the proof of concept. Then you actually build it, you pilot it, typically outside any systems, so you keep it nice and light. Then there's the proof of value. After having tested it, you do a business case and see if we were to scale this, what would the impact be? What would it cost? Is it a good idea? Yes, no. And finally, there's the proof of scale, which is developing the big rollout map. How do we get it, of course, integrated in our IT systems? How do we get it to the front line? And how do we, what does the full plan, the full roadmap for this initiative look like? And if we open up the first one, then as we talked about before, you can start with kind of a process lens and look at these different areas that you could use these tools for. And I think there are 3 questions, but the 2 main ones are, first is the efficiency play. So which processes could data-driven sales tools make faster? Right. So for example, that would be the RFP case. We're spending a lot of time on something manual. It's not super value adding. How can we make it faster? The second one is how can we make it better? And I think that's more the segmentation case. How can we make account research automated and better? So we equip the salespeople better with this account research that they couldn't do before on their own. But there's also the third one of dreaming big. And that is, how could these tools help us reimagine entire workflows, entire ways of working? And I think that's an important point to keep in mind, that these new tools are incredibly powerful. They're developing all the time. So sometimes we also need to dream big and go a little bit outside the convention and allow ourselves to be inspired by something a bit more, taking a bit of a leap in how we do things, because new things are going to open up, and we are probably, of course, biased by what we're used to do. So just keeping that in mind, that actually there might be some new possibilities that we're not really considering at this point. But once you've done that, you found processes that could be better, faster, or reimagined, then you assess the impact and the feasibility. So what's the impact if we succeed with this initiative? What can we reasonably estimate that we can, how much faster can we make it? How much better can we make it? What's the impact of that? Can we increase the conversion rate, the win rate, the churn rate? What can we do with this tool? And what would it cost to make it and implement it? And once you've done that, you can make a nice little 2x2 matrix and then select the use cases you want to prototype. Maybe it's 1, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3, but definitely not 10. Yeah, so start small and go from there. All right, so that was the first step. Now we have identified where potential could reside in our commercial organization. This framework could, in essence, be anywhere, but in a commercial organization. And now we need the proof of concept. We need to show that it actually works. And here we really want to make it work at the front line in the real life environment where it's going to be used later. And in order to make this a proof of concept, there are a few different bits and bobs that are involved in making these solutions. Typically, you have some data, some internal data that feeds into a processing loop. So the data is kind of cleaned and formatted and organized, and then there is a logic on top. And that could be an LLM, like in this case. It could also be a rule-based logic that's coded in Python. It could be even something that runs in an Excel sheet. But there's some kind of logic that formats and scores and gives the output that we want. That output is then transferred into the application, which is typically a CRM system. And then it runs. Maybe there's some input that comes back to the core processing, but then that's kind of the loop. Some of it is also hosted on different services, but that's typically what these kind of frameworks look like. And while this may seem a little bit daunting, then it's just to illustrate that the tool is going to be part of a broader ecosystem, especially once fully implemented. But the prototype does not have to be. So ideally, you want to maybe extract the data, run it in Excel just to prototype it and see what it does. And then once we have the output, we test it at the front line with a few reps and see how it works. Because we really want to delay getting into the systems, because I mean, just sneezing in Salesforce will cost you 2 million, right? So it's really about keeping it nice and light and simple until we have proof that it actually works at the front line. Second point here, again, don't be married to AI. Sometimes AI is fantastic, but sometimes it's not necessary. For example, the segmentation service does not involve AI. It could have an AI interface, but it doesn't really need it because the output is already put into CRM directly, and there are dashboards where you can get to know more about your installers. So when it doesn't have to be there, there's no need to force it in there. And the third point is, again, pilot and stress test at the front line. Testing the tool in a real life environment just, in a sense, it forces you to make a lot of micro decisions that are easy to oversee and forget when you sit in the ivory tower and design your solution. But when you come out to the front line and the sales rep says, okay, but how do I do this? What does this mean? Then all of a sudden you are forced to think a bit more kind of in real terms, and you see what works and what does not in just a very different way than you could if you don't go to the front line. So big recommendation is to do that. All right, that was a little bit technical, but now we've done the proof of concept, we have designed it, and we have tested it at the front line. Next up is then making a business case that proves the value of the solution. So typically, it will run something along the lines of establishing a baseline. So what are we doing today? Then outlining the expected impact. Again, what would this enable us to do? Would it enable us to visit more customers? Would it enable us to have better conversations with the customers we're already visiting? Is it an efficiency play? Would it mean that we would, again, churn fewer customers, win more customers, win against a certain competitor, drive a strategic agenda? Whatever it might be, what is the impact? Then we detail the prototype's value. Ideally, we see how did it perform at the front line. Sometimes it's, of course, hard to get real-life sales data depending on the solution. But the more we can get of leading or lagging indicators from the front line, the better. And then finally, what's the return on investment when this is rolled out for all the relevant people in scope, for all the right users, the use case, and what's then kind of the return on the investment. And I think with this, it's important to keep in mind that like sometimes I feel that it's easy to get scared by a business case and that you have to underline it with 2 lines and really commit to the accuracy of it. But there's just an inherent lack of accuracy sometimes in these business cases, and that's all right. But you have to estimate with a 10-20% up or down, and we need to do a little bit of napkin math in order to the purpose of this is more to get an idea of, is it a good idea or not? It's not to get the exact plan, 10-year plan mapped down to 2 decimals. So I think that's also important to keep in mind. It's a directional business case we're looking for, not something to be not something that's gonna be planned out for the next 10 years. Good. So now we have the proof of value, and now we need to design the proof of scale. So what is this gonna look like when we develop it? And in this big rollout plan, I think there are 3 steps. One is developing, so making the tool fully functional. Maybe there's more functionality that wasn't in the prototype. Maybe there's some local market adaptations if you're a global company that needs to roll it out. How we're going to get that in place, of course, needs to be detailed. Then there's the implementation. So both getting it into the tech stack and the systems, integrations, API, synchronizations, how is all that going to work and get set up? And finally, how is it going to be adopted? So training and onboarding of the users, how are they going to understand and use the tool? Who's going to own the tool? Who's going to maintain it and operate it? And then also how we're going to get feedback into the tool so we over time make it better. So all these things we need to document, of course. How is this going to happen in the company? And finally, there's just a little bit of a warning in this case, and that is avoiding the death in IT trap, which is something we have witnessed happen to a few companies. And what we're seeing here is the difference between solutions that are at an early stage, so at a kind of proof of concept stage, and then solutions that go into production. And we can see there's a really, really big difference between them, and especially for sales, with just the third one from the right, it's less than 5 to 10% of these people that have been asked that has something in production. So it really speaks to this picture that it is difficult in sales, but it also speaks to another thing that typically when you go to production, the full production, then you involve IT. And IT, for many good reasons, just has a different timeline than most commercial organizations do. They have a big backlog, and they are typically quite, they have a lot on their plate, and it means they have a different timeline. And sometimes when these solutions are ready, then they are outdated in the commercial organization. So really, it's about trying to keep ownership of the solution for as long as possible, keeping ownership of the data for as long as possible, see if you can get it to work in a nice and light manner, and then once it's ready, then get it automated and put into the IT systems. But I think the danger is in getting it integrated into IT systems too quickly, especially before you have proved the value, before you have tested it at the front line, because then it gets way less flexible once it gets into those IT systems. So avoid that trap. Good. So that's the overall process of going from proof of play to proof of scale. And the reason we like that approach is that there are 3 main advantages to it. It's fast, it's cheap, and it's low risk. And what we mean by that is that usually developing a prototype like this takes 10 to 12 weeks. It's something relatively short. Even when you have AI tools, there's a lot of ways you can test it and try it in sandbox environments before setting up fully integrated solutions. You can quite easily make API calls to, for example, ChatGPT if you need a user face, and you can upload data behind it that it draws on. So it is actually possible, even with the more advanced AI tools, you can make it very quickly. And that is just a huge advantage in this explorative environment where we need to test before we know if stuff actually works. Second is that it's cheap. A prototype like this is probably 300,000 to 500,000 for a fully working one that's been tested at the front line, where again, if you start making stuff directly in your CRM system, it's going to cost you a lot more and be a lot more expensive. And the third one is again this low risk, where IT projects are notorious, I think, for being very expensive and taking a lot of time. And again, for many reasons, there's again definitely no IT bashing from my side. It's just how it works with these technical solutions. It is just difficult and a lot of moving parts. But one way again to de-risk is to make this prototyping and get to that critical cutoff point. Is, does it work at the front line? So if we get to that cutoff point before we invest the big money, we really save ourselves a lot of risk, and that's why we recommend this approach, so that it's proven to work before you move into the expensive territory of integrating it into the systems. Good. Final reflection here from my side before we get to the Q&A is that it is, of course, a learning journey, and in this journey, I think it's best to increase maturity and sophistication, kind of tool by tool or iteration by iteration. And I think the best way is again to develop this roadmap that we talked about before, and then kind of plan out to do one tool at a time. So maybe you start with something that's a bit simpler, something that's not integrated in a tech stack, like, for example, the Excel prospecting model, just scoring a lot of prospects so you can find the most attractive ones. And then maybe you move to something that's slightly more complex, maybe something that's partially integrated in the tech stack, maybe like a sales interaction tool, the second case we showed. And then you move to something more complex than that, that's end-to-end integrated and automated, for example, like the segmentation service. And the reason for that is that it's typically quite good to be flexible and kind of reassess after each steps, because you learn a lot along the way, and it's not just the technical capabilities, but it's also the organizational capabilities. So how data literate are the people in your sales organization? How comfortable are they with these tools? How much do they understand them, and how much do they use them? Because I think it's very easy to get high on the AI pipe and kind of forget that unless somebody actually uses these tools, they are not really valuable. So getting this change management thinking into this learning journey for me is a super important aspect of having success with these tools. So yeah, I think the best way to increase that organizational maturity is to do it tool by tool, and then integrating the learning and then doing the next tool or iteration of a former tool. All right, that was a bit about AI and how to get started with AI or data-driven tools. And now it's time for Q&A. So if you have questions, please pop them in the question section, and then I will do my very best to answer them. All right. Let's see. Okay. What is your view on building versus buying AI tools? Yep, I think that's a really, really good question. Because if you build tools yourself, you commit yourself, of course, to a large portion of technical debt. And this technical debt is, of course, it means that you have to maintain the tool, and you have to update the tool, you have to kind of keep it going, because otherwise it's going to get outdated and not work. So really, it's a balance between how much do you need it to be tailored to your organization, and what can you buy out there. So I think let me just actually go back to this one, because building or buying, I think, has to be viewed from the kind of the process framework in which the solution exists. Because in many cases, you already have the internal data, you have the core processing, and then what you really build or buy is that logic that goes on top. So in this case, the LLM model. And my overall tip is buy as much as possible, because then you're not weighed down by the technical debt, but you could get somebody else to do it. And the second thing is, of course, the development. I think with LLMs, it's very much a no-brainer. You are never going to compete with ChatGPT. You're never going to compete with neither OpenAI or Google or any of the other Mistral, any of the other players in the space, and you shouldn't even try. If you have simpler logics or logics that are very tailored to you and your organization, then it can make sense, again, depending on how heavy the technology is. Probably, if it's something you can code in Excel or Python, then the technical debt is not going to be that big. But if it's something that exists out of the box in the market, I would go for that. Of course, given that it's not overly expensive. But long story short, define what you can build or buy in that process framework of your AI or data-driven tool, and then buy as much as possible, as much as is feasible within that context. So you take on as little technical debt and you outsource the ongoing development to somebody else. Yep. Okay. The number of AI tools are mushrooming, especially in the sales and marketing domain, it seems, but they all seem to have the individual, fairly narrow niche function. I hear more and more that companies use a sequence of these tools to improve their processes. Is that what you're seeing as well? Is this a reasonable course of action in your opinion? Maybe a little bit of background before I answer directly is that I think what we are seeing is that in the industry in general, in the AI industry, what's happening is that it's getting super consolidated, right? So right now, of course, all the GPU providers, no one's going to enter that. All the LLM providers, OpenAI, Mistral, Anthropic, and so on, it's really, really hard to enter that because the barriers are so high. What's still open, though, is the layers on top that connects these general learning models to very specific use cases. And I think that's what's getting referred to here as well, that more and more companies come in and take that last mile delivery, so to speak, where they wrap some of these tools, for example, and translate it into what it can do in a commercial setting. And I think that we're going to see more and more of these tools over time. So I definitely agree with the picture that these tools are both mushrooming and also becoming more and more niche and taking up their own little sliver of the market as these tools get more and more specific and targeted. The interesting thing is, of course, which of these tools are going to survive. Because right now the market, flooded is maybe a big word, but a lot of them are entering the market and not all of them are going to survive. So I think it's a bit of a balance. Again, to answer the question directly, it's a bit of a balance in, do you really believe this company is going to exist, and how invested are you? What's the risk if they are suddenly not here tomorrow? Because, for example, a tool like ChatGPT, go ahead, use it. There's really no harm if they shut it down tomorrow, except that you lose the efficiency gains. But if it's something that's directly embedded and your company is really relying on it, then of course it involves a bit more risk. Overall, I would probably lean towards a quite high level of experimentation with these different tools. But for many of them, the quality is still developing, so to speak. So I think it has to be very tool specific and for the organization you're in. It's a bit of a fluffy answer, I know, but I just think there's such a big difference between both the quality of the tools the quality of the companies behind them, and also how it impacts the day-to-day life of your business. So I think those has to be taken into account. Have you done successful AI use cases in priming promo part of the commercial engine? And I personally have not been involved in these dynamic real-life pricing projects. No, I can't say that I have. But if needed, I can contact you afterwards with someone who has. How can businesses ensure that ethical use of AI and data in sales processes while still maximizing efficiency and personalization? Yes. This is a good one, because I think there is a lot of debate about it, and I mean, there are of course a few different viewpoints, right? And I think the main issue is that a lot of the data, what happens, you don't really have any control over. Like, how is all the ChatGPT data used? We actually don't know. We know what they say, but there have been scandals before. So it's really hard to 100% safeguard yourself against data being used in the right way. What you can do, of course, is make sure that all the GDPR and personal compliance parts are being taken care of on your side, and hopefully you do that anyway. But I think that's mostly what we can do, and then we can vet our vendors quite rigorously. So if we have any like giant multinational vendors, how are they treating personal data, and how are they using it? I think those are the two main ones. In our own systems, we have to take care of how the data is used and how it's and to whom it's accessible. So we make sure that it's in a closed-off environment where people who can't get access or shouldn't have access to sensitive information don't have it. For companies just starting to explore AI-driven sales, how can Quadrant Consulting guide the implementation process to ensure measurable ROI and alignment with business goals? That's a good question. And for this, I think especially it depends on where they are, of course, in their maturity. But if they're just starting to explore it, it's again about identifying possible use cases. So here, of course, we'll be able to understand how is the commercial organization working, which processes are they running, and what is the gap from how they're running it to a best practice, and how could these data-driven sales tools help us close those practices. So of course we only do B2B sales and marketing. It's all we do. It's what we live and breathe. So of course we're able to provide some best practice perspectives on what those processes should look like. And of course we also have experience in creating these AI tools. So we'd also be able to help create them, at least until the proof of play. Probably not us you want integrating the solutions into your ERP system, but we can definitely help up until that part. Let's see if there are any more questions. No? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for listening in. If you have any other questions, you're welcome to write me an email to me or any of my colleagues, and we'll be happy to help you out with any questions you might have. So thank you so much for spending this lovely Tuesday morning with me, and I wish you all the best in your day and in your AI adventures. Thank you, and bye-bye.